Haunted Mansion's darkest secret revealed. Shocking finale you can't miss. Chapter 1. The Journey. The sky, once a brilliant canvas of blue, now hung over the earth like a shroud, heavy with the ashes of a world that had crumbled. What had been cities were now ghostly silhouettes, skeletal remains of a civilization that had collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. The land was a barren wasteland, scarred by whatever calamity had swept through, leaving behind only whispers of the life that once thrived here. Ethan trudged ahead, his boots crunching over the cracked earth. His broad shoulders, once a symbol of strength and protection, now bore the weight of responsibility for the small group that followed him. The fireman's uniform he used to wear was long gone, replaced by a tattered coat and a deep wariness etched into his face. But the fire still burned within him, a stubborn flame of duty that refused to be extinguished by the horrors of this new world. Behind him, Claire walked with a silent determination that belied the storm of grief raging inside her. Her eyes, once filled with the warmth of a mother's love, were now cold and hollow, reflecting the emptiness that had settled in her heart since she lost her family. She clutched a small, battered photograph in her hand, the edges worn from too many touches. It was all she had left of them, a reminder of a life that felt like a distant dream. Marcus followed a few paces behind, his gaze scanning the horizon with a practiced wariness. He had survived not by chance, but by a keen instinct honed over years of living on the edge. The mechanic's hands, calloused from years of work, were never far from the makeshift weapons he carried, a reminder of the darkness that lingered not just in the world, but within himself. His past was a shadow he couldn't escape, no matter how far he walked. Sarah was the youngest of the group, yet there was something in her eyes that spoke of an understanding far beyond her years. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence almost ethereal, as if she were somehow apart from the grim reality they all faced. There was an aura around her, a sense that she was connected to something beyond this world, something that had guided her through the ruins of humanity and brought her to this group of survivors. Jonas, the oldest among them, brought up the rear. His steps were slower, his breath labored, but his mind was as sharp as ever. The former history professor had seen civilizations rise and fall through the pages of books, but now he was witnessing it firsthand. He had always been a man of reason, a believer in logic and facts, but the world they now wandered through defied all that he had known. Still, he clung to the role of the group's moral compass, guiding them not just through the physical wasteland, but through the moral quagmires that arose in this new world order. The group had been traveling for days, perhaps weeks. Time had lost its meaning in the endless gray of their journey. The only thing that drove them forward was the hope of finding a place where they could stop, rest, and maybe, just maybe, start to rebuild something resembling a life. It was Sarah who first spotted the faded scrap of paper fluttering against a broken fence post, half buried under the dust and debris. She knelt to retrieve it, her fingers brushing away the grime to reveal the faint lines of a map. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but there was no mistaking the depiction of a mountain range, with a small X marking a spot high up in the peaks. Ethan took the map from her, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines with his finger. "It's a long shot," he muttered, "but it's the first sign of anything we've seen in days." Claire leaned in, her expression unreadable. "What's there?" she asked, though the question was more rhetorical than anything. In this world, anything could lie in wait. Safety, or more likely, death. "An old mansion, if this map is right," Jonas answered, his voice gravelly. "Could be a safe haven, untouched by whatever wiped out the rest of the world. Or it could be another trap," Marcus added, his voice tinged with the cynicism that had kept him alive this long. "We've seen plenty of those. But we can't keep wandering like this." Sarah interjected softly, her voice carrying an unusual weight. "We have to try." Ethan studied the map again, feeling the pressure of the group's expectations. He knew the risks. They all did. But what choice did they have? The land they walked was dead, offering nothing but more of the same emptiness that stretched out before them. The mansion, whatever it was, represented a chance, maybe their last. "All right," he said finally, folding the map and tucking it into his coat. "We head for the mountains, but we stay sharp. no one lets their guard down. And so, with the promise of a refuge guiding their steps, the group set off toward the distant peaks, their shadows long against the dying light. They moved in silence, each lost in their thoughts, aware that this journey could be their salvation or their end. The world had become a place of shadows, where even hope could lead them astray. But it was all they had left. And so, they walked on, into the unknown. Chapter 2. The Mansion. The mansion loomed ahead like a dark monolith, its towering silhouette etched against the gray sky. Unlike the ruins they had passed, this place stood almost untouched by the catastrophe that had ravaged the world. The trees surrounding it were wild and untamed, their branches gnarled and twisted, as if they had grown in defiance of the chaos that had claimed everything else. The group paused at the edge of the overgrown forest, taking in the sight before them, a place that seemed suspended in time, as if it had been waiting for them. Ethan was the first to step forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the building. It was grand, almost palatial, with high windows that glinted in the fading light. Ivy clung to the walls like fingers, weaving up toward the cracked stonework. The front doors were massive, heavy wood that had somehow remained intact, guarding whatever secrets lay inside. "Looks like something out of a Gothic novel," Jonas muttered, his voice carrying a note of apprehension. The historian in him recognized the architecture, Victorian, maybe earlier, but there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Claire stood close to Ethan, her breath catching at the sight of the mansion. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this place could be different, that it might offer them the respite they so desperately needed. But the memory of what they had seen, what they had survived, was a cold reminder that nothing was ever as it seemed. "It doesn't look real," Sarah whispered, almost to herself. Her voice was soft, tinged with a distant fear. The young woman's gaze was fixed on the mansion's windows, where the glass seemed to shimmer as if something moved behind it. But when she blinked, the movement was gone, leaving only her reflection staring back at her. Marcus was more practical. He approached the doors, testing the handle. It gave way with a creak, and he pushed the door open slowly, half expecting something to lunge out from the darkness beyond. But there was only silence, a thick, oppressive quiet that made his skin crawl. "After you," he said, stepping aside with a gesture that was more habit than courtesy. Ethan nodded, taking the lead once more. He stepped over the threshold, his boots echoing on the marble floor inside. The others followed, their eyes wide as they took in the interior. A grand foyer with a sweeping staircase, chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen teardrops, and walls lined with old portraits. The air was cool, almost too cool, and carried the scent of age and dust. "A place like this should have been looted long ago," Marcus observed, his voice low. "But everything's untouched." The group spread out cautiously, exploring the main hall. The mansion's interior was a stark contrast to the devastation outside. The furniture, though old and covered in a fine layer of dust, was intact. The walls were adorned with tapestries and paintings that seemed to have been spared the passage of time. It was as if the house had been frozen in the moment, just before the world ended. Jonas lingered by one of the paintings, an elaborate portrait of a man in aristocratic attire. The figure's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved, a trick of the light, no doubt, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He turned away, unsettled, only to find that every portrait in the room seemed to watch them with the same eerie intensity. "Whoever lived here had money," Claire murmured, running her fingers over the back of an ornate chair. The wood was smooth, polished, as if someone had cared for it, even as the world outside fell apart. "Too much money," Marcus replied, eyeing a gilded mirror that reflected their images with a faint distortion. He frowned at his own reflection, feeling as though something was wrong, but unable to pinpoint what. Sarah drifted away from the group, her footsteps soft on the plush carpet. She was drawn to a side hallway where the shadows seemed deeper, almost alive. A draft blew through, carrying a faint whisper that she couldn't quite catch. She paused, peering into the darkness, her pulse quickening. It felt like the house was watching her too, waiting for something. Ethan found the kitchen first, his relief palpable when he opened the pantry to find it stocked with canned goods and dried food. "We could stay here for a while," he said, the first hint of hope in his voice since they had started their journey. "There's enough to last us, and the utilities seem to be working." The group gathered in the kitchen, the warmth of the stove a welcome change from the cold outside. For a moment, it almost felt normal, like a family gathering around the hearth. They ate in silence, each lost in their thoughts, but there was an unspoken tension between them, a sense that they were not alone in the house. It wasn't until later, when the group had settled into the various rooms they had chosen, that the mansion began to reveal its true nature. Claire was the first to notice it, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hall outside her room. She opened the door cautiously, expecting to see one of the others, but the corridor was empty. The sound continued, though, moving further away, down the hall and out of sight. She shut the door, her heart racing, convincing herself it was just the old wood creaking. In another part of the mansion, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, the walls pressing in on him. He could feel a draft, cold and sharp, though there were no open windows. The air seemed to thrum with an unseen energy, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. He clenched his fists, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah lay awake in her room, her eyes wide in the darkness. She could hear whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices from another time. They drifted through the walls, too faint to understand, but their presence was unmistakable. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, but it did nothing to quell the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Jonas, too, felt the weight of the mansion's gaze. He had chosen a room with a view of the overgrown garden, hoping for a sense of peace. But as he sat by the window, watching the shadows lengthen outside, he could feel eyes on him, unseen, but there all the same. He turned away from the window, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his sight. Ethan lay in bed, his mind too alert to rest. He stared up at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. It was just the wind, he told himself, just the natural sounds of a building this age. But there was something more, something beneath the surface that he couldn't ignore. The mansion had welcomed them in, offered them shelter from the broken world outside. But as the night wore on, it became clear that they were not alone within its walls. The house was alive with secrets, and as the group drifted into uneasy sleep, those secrets began to stir, waiting to be uncovered. In the silence, the mansion watched and waited. Chapter 3: The Unseen. The next morning dawned with a pale, lifeless light that filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to the walls. The air was thick with an unease that had settled in the night before, a tension that none of the group could shake. The house, so grand and inviting at first, now felt like a trap, its silence oppressive and its secrets lurking just out of reach. Ethan was the first to rise. His sleep had been restless, haunted by dreams that slipped away like shadows the moment he opened his eyes. He moved through the mansion with a growing sense of dread, as if the walls were closing in on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows felt like a warning. He found himself in the library, a vast room lined with shelves of old, dusty books. It was there, among the forgotten tomes, that he discovered the first of the mansion's secrets. The diary was hidden behind a row of thick volumes, its leather cover cracked with age. Ethan opened it carefully, the pages yellowed and brittle, filled with the spidery handwriting of someone long gone. The entries were dated over a century ago, written by the mansion's original owner, Lord Edwin Blackwood, a man of wealth and power, but with a darkness that seeped through his words. Ethan read in silence, his brow furrowing as he learned of Lord Blackwood's obsession with the occult. The diary spoke of rituals, of summoning forces beyond comprehension, of bending reality to his will. Blackwood had been a man consumed by his desire for control, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his ends. The final entry was abrupt, the handwriting frantic. The ritual is complete. I have bound it to this place. It will never leave. A chill ran down Ethan's spine as he closed the diary. He knew he had to tell the others, but a part of him hesitated. This knowledge, this understanding of what the mansion truly was, felt like a burden, one that could tear the group apart. When he returned to the kitchen, the others were already there, their faces pale and drawn. Claire was pacing, her movements quick and erratic. She had found something too, a bundle of old newspaper clippings stuffed in a drawer. The headlines were sensational, the stories lurid. Mysterious disappearances plague Blackwood Manor, cult activity, suspected in local mansion, aristocrat's death linked to dark practices. The dates on the articles spanned decades, each one hinting at the mansion's malevolent history. "We shouldn't be here," Claire said, her voice trembling. "This place, it's wrong. We need to leave. Now." Ethan looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she held the clippings. "I found a diary," he said, his voice low. "The owner, he was into something dark, really dark." Marcus, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I knew it," he muttered, almost to himself. "I felt it the moment we walked in. This place, it's alive." Sarah, sitting at the table, seemed oddly calm, her fingers tracing the edge of a teacup. "The mansion has a presence," she said, her voice almost reverent. "It watches us. It listens." "That's not comforting," Jonas replied, his tone sharp. The older man was usually the voice of reason, but now there was an edge to his words, a crack in his composure. "We should have never come here. This house, it's not safe." The tension in the room was palpable, the group on the verge of breaking. Ethan could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty that gnawed at them. He knew he had to keep them together, but the mansion's influence was growing stronger, feeding on their doubts. The strange occurrences that had begun the night before only escalated as the day wore on. Doors slammed shut without warning, the sound reverberating through the halls like a gunshot. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, moving in ways that defied explanation. Objects disappeared, only to reappear in places they hadn't been left. The temperature in the rooms fluctuated wildly, a sudden chill freezing the air even as the sunlight streamed through the windows. Claire was the first to crack under the pressure. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the others were hiding something from her. Her eyes darted around the room, never resting in one place for long, and she flinched at every sound, no matter how small. She began to withdraw, isolating herself in one of the smaller rooms, where she could keep the door locked and the windows covered. Marcus, too, began to pull away. He spent most of his time in the basement, where he claimed he was fixing things, though no one ever saw what he was working on. He grew more secretive, his expression dark and brooding, as if he were carrying a burden too heavy to share. Ethan tried to keep everyone together, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was a losing battle. The mansion was wearing them down, feeding on their fear and suspicion. Even Jonas, usually the voice of reason, was growing more distant, his thoughts turning inward as he struggled to make sense of the madness that surrounded them. Only Sarah seemed unaffected, or rather, attuned to the mansion's supernatural elements. She moved through the house with an eerie grace, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were seeing things the others couldn't. She spoke less and less, her words often cryptic and unsettling. The others began to avoid her, unnerved by her strange behavior, but she seemed unfazed, as if the mansion's malevolent presence was something she welcomed. As night fell, the group gathered in the library, the one room where they still felt some measure of safety. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did little to chase away the cold that had settled into their bones. The mansion seemed to close in around them, its shadows stretching long and dark across the floor. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, her voice trembling with desperation. "This place is driving us mad." Ethan nodded, though he had no idea where they would go. The outside world was no safer, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The mansion was playing with them, toying with their minds, and if they didn't leave soon, it would consume them. But as they made plans to escape, the mansion seemed to react, the air growing thick with a palpable sense of menace. The fire in the hearth flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. A low, guttural sound echoed through the walls, a sound that could have been the wind or something far more sinister. In the pitch-black room, they could feel the mansion's eyes on them, watching, waiting. And as the sound grew louder, closer, they realized with dawning horror that they were not alone. The unseen had awoken, and it was hungry. Chapter 4: The Haunting. The mansion had come alive, and it wasn't subtle about its intentions. The The first real assault came in the dead of night. It began with a whisper, a sound so faint that at first it was dismissed as the rustling of leaves outside or the shifting of the old house as it settled. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a chorus of voices, echoing through the mansion's hollow corridors. Ethan was jolted awake by the noise, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay still, straining to listen, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind. But the voices grew louder, rising to a cacophony that seemed to surround. They were not words, not exactly, but a low, menacing murmur that slithered into his ears and coiled around his mind. He stumbled out of bed, barely registering that the others were awake as well, drawn by the same eerie sounds. The group gathered in the hallway, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The whispers swirled around them, a disembodied chant that seemed to come from the very walls. "What the hell is that?" Marcus growled, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. He looked around, his eyes darting from one shadowed corner to another, searching for a source that couldn't be found. "It's the house," Sarah said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. She stood apart from the others, her expression eerily serene. "It's trying to tell us something." Jonas shook his head, a deep frown etched into his features. "No, it's trying to drive us mad. We need to get out of here before it's too late." But even as he spoke, the mansion responded. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere were closing in on them. The temperature dropped suddenly, a frigid chill that froze the breath in their lungs. The shadows, that had been merely unsettling before, now seemed to move with purpose, stretching out long fingers that crept closer with each passing second. Then the first object moved, a chair in the parlor that slid across the floor with a scraping sound that made everyone jump. It was followed by the slam of a door somewhere in the distance, and then another and another, until it felt like the whole house was shifting around them. The whispers grew into a roar, a deafening din that drowned out even their own thoughts. Claire let out a scream, backing away from the group, her eyes wild with panic. "We can't stay here. We have to leave now." Her voice was shrill, her desperation palpable. But Sarah stepped forward, her gaze fixed on something unseen. "No," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "There's something here, something important. The house is showing us the way." Ethan turned to her, his face taut with concern. "Sarah, this place is tearing us apart. We need to go before it gets worse." But Sarah shook her head, her expression resolute. "It's been calling to me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Since we arrived, I've heard it. There's a room hidden somewhere in the house. That's where we need to go." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "You're out of your mind. We should have never come here in the first place. Now you want to stay?" Claire clutched her arms, trying to steady herself. "Maybe she's right," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe. Maybe the answers we need are in that room. Maybe that's why we were led here." Jonas looked between them, his expression one of deep conflict. "This place is evil," he said, his voice shaking. "Whatever's in that room, it can't be good. We need to leave. Now." Ethan felt the weight of his responsibility crushing down on him. As the leader, he had to make the call, but the house seemed to have its own plans. It was as if the mansion was alive, reacting to their every move, manipulating their thoughts and emotions. He could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt gnawing at their resolve. The mansion was winning. Another crash echoed through the house, louder this time, closer. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, the whispers became a scream, a high-pitched wail that seemed to pierce their very souls. In that moment, the group splintered. Claire, unable to handle the pressure, bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the house as she ran. Marcus, cursing under his breath, followed her, his footsteps heavy with anger and fear. Jonas hesitated, his face torn with indecision, but then he, too, turned and walked away, muttering about the madness of it all. Ethan watched them go, his heart sinking. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing in the same spot, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "What do you think is in that room?" he asked quietly. Sarah's gaze finally met his, and there was something in her eyes, something almost otherworldly. "The truth," she said simply, "and maybe a way out." Ethan didn't know whether to believe her or not, but he had no other choice. The mansion had them in its grip, and there was no escaping its clutches now. If Sarah was right, if there was something in that hidden room that could help them, then he had to try. "Let's find it," he said, his voice steady, though fear still gnawed at him, "before it finds us first." As they moved deeper into the mansion, the walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. The whispers followed them, a constant presence, a reminder that the house was alive, watching, waiting. Each step they took felt like a journey into the unknown, a descent into the heart of the mansion's darkness. And the mansion, it seemed, was eager to show them just how dark it could be. Chapter 5: The Hidden Room. The mansion seemed to guide their steps, as if it wanted them to find what lay hidden within its walls. Sarah led the way, her movements deliberate, almost trance-like, as if she was following an invisible thread that only she could see. Ethan stayed close behind her, his nerves on edge, while the others trailed in uneasy silence, the air thick with dread. They passed through corridors that twisted and turned, the walls narrowing as they went deeper into the bowels of the house. The whispers had faded into a low hum, a constant, unsettling drone that vibrated through the very structure of the mansion. It felt as though the house was alive, its pulse echoing in the walls, its breath cold against their skin. Finally, Sarah stopped in front of a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. She ran her fingers along the surface, searching for something only she knew was there. After a moment, there was a soft click, and a portion of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow doorway. Ethan exchanged a glance with Jonas, who nodded grimly. Whatever lay beyond that door, they had no choice but to face it. The group stepped through the opening, entering a small, windowless room. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of decay, and the only light came from the weak beams of their flashlights. The room was cluttered with old, rotting furniture, and in the center stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface obscured by a black cloth. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood, and an old wooden table in the corner was stacked with books, tomes that looked ancient and forbidden, their pages yellowed with age. Jonas moved to the table, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up one of the books. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he recognized the symbols within. "These are rituals," he said, his voice hoarse. "Rites to summon and bind spirits. This place, it's a trap, a prison for the dead." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the group. Claire shuddered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This place is cursed." But Sarah was transfixed by the mirror, her gaze locked on the cloth that concealed it. Without a word, she stepped forward and reached for the fabric. Ethan moved to stop her, but something in her expression made him hesitate. There was a determination in her eyes, a silent resolve that told him this was something she needed to do. She pulled the cloth away, revealing the mirror beneath. For a moment, the room was silent as they stared at their reflections, pale, ghostly figures in the dim light. But then, as the seconds ticked by, their reflections began to change. The faces in the mirror twisted, distorted by pain and despair, until they were no longer looking at themselves, but at the tormented souls trapped within the glass. The spirits pressed against the surface, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and pleading. Their agony was palpable, a force that radiated from the mirror and filled the room with a cold, suffocating fear. Marcus recoiled, his face contorted in horror. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What did you do?" Jonas stepped closer, his expression one of grim realization. "This mirror, it's a portal. These spirits are trapped, bound to this place by the rituals performed here. They can't move on, and now they're reaching out to us." Sarah's hand trembled as she touched the surface of the mirror, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "I've seen them before," she murmured, her voice distant. "In my dreams, they've been calling to me, showing me the way, but I didn't understand until now." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean? How are you connected to them?" She closed her eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of memories and visions that had plagued her for so long. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I feel their pain, their desperation. They want to be free, to escape this nightmare, and somehow I'm a part of it." Claire backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here. This place is evil, and it's going to kill us if we stay." But Sarah shook her head, her gaze never leaving the mirror. "No," she said softly. "We can't just leave them here. We have to do something. There must be a way to release them, to end this." Jonas frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. If these rituals were used to bind the spirits, then maybe there's a way to reverse it. But it's dangerous. We're dealing with forces beyond our understanding. Ethan felt a surge of frustration and fear. They were caught in a nightmare with no clear way out, and every decision seemed fraught with peril. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. "Try to help these spirits and risk everything, or leave now and save ourselves." The group was silent, each of them grappling with the enormity of the choice before them. The mansion had led them here, to this room, to this mirror. But was it guiding them toward salvation or damnation? The answer was elusive, hidden in the shadows that crept closer with each passing moment. Sarah turned to the others, her expression resolute. "We can't just leave them here to suffer. If there's a chance to free them, we have to try. It's the right thing to do." Ethan met her gaze, seeing the determination in her eyes. He didn't fully understand the connection she had with this place, with these spirits, but he knew that she believed in what she was saying. And in this dark, twisted world, belief was sometimes all they had left. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We'll try, but we need to be careful. This place, it's dangerous. We don't know what we're dealing with." Jonas nodded, his face grim. "I'll look through these books, see if there's anything about reversing the rituals, but we need to be prepared. The spirits might not be the only ones tied to this place." As they began to search the room for answers, the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. The mansion seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the walls closing in around them. Time was running out, and the shadows that lurked in the corners were no longer content to watch in silence. The house had brought them to this moment, and now it was watching, waiting to see what they would do next. Chapter 6: The Sacrifice. The mansion had become a living nightmare, every corner a lurking threat, every shadow a harbinger of dread. The malevolent presence that had always been just beneath the surface now surged forward, relentless, consuming. The air itself seemed to throb with malicious intent, thick with a sense of impending doom. There was no longer any illusion of safety. The walls of the mansion pressed in, oppressive and unyielding. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The whispers had grown into a cacophony, voices overlapping in a desperate, incoherent chorus. He could feel the weight of the house bearing down on him, the pressure of its dark history squeezing the breath from his lungs. "The spirits want out," Jonas said, his voice low and grave. He had been poring over the ancient texts they had found, his face lined with exhaustion and fear. The ritual, it wasn't just about trapping them, it was about binding them here, using their agony to fuel something darker. To break the curse, a life must be given willingly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan could feel the eyes of the group him, the weight of their fear and expectation heavy on his shoulders. He had led them this far, kept them alive through all the horrors they had faced. It was only right that he should be the one to end it, to pay the price. "I'll do it," he said quietly, the resolve in his voice clear. He saw the shock in their faces, the immediate resistance, but he knew there was no other choice. "This needs to end. We can't keep running from this place, from what's happening here. If a sacrifice is what it takes, then it should be me." Claire's face paled, her eyes wide with horror. "No, Ethan. You can't. We need you. We can find another way. There has to be another way." But even as she said it, they all knew the truth. The mansion was alive with the spirits' rage, their pain, and it would not be sated until the sacrifice was made. The ritual had been clear. Only through a willing death could the cycle be broken, the spirits released from their torment. Marcus stood apart from the others, his face shadowed, unreadable. The darkness in the room seemed to cling to him, as if the house itself recognized him, marked him. He had been quiet ever since they'd uncovered the truth, his thoughts locked away, distant. But now, something shifted in his gaze, a grim determination settling over him. "I'll do it," Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. The others turned to him, disbelief and confusion in their eyes. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "Marcus, no, I can't let you do that. This is my responsibility. I brought us here. I should be the one to—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm, almost resigned. "This is my chance, Ethan, my chance to make things right." They stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Marcus had always been the quiet one, the one with the dark past he rarely spoke of. But they had all sensed the guilt that hung over him, the burden he carried from a life before the catastrophe. Now, it was as if he had finally found a way to atone, to find peace. "I've done things," Marcus continued, his voice raw with emotion. "Things I can't take back. This is my way of paying for that. If I can save you all, then maybe I can find some redemption in it." Claire shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "We don't want to lose you, Marcus. We're all in this together. We can find another way." But Marcus shook his head, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "There is no other way. The house won't let us go until it has what it wants, and I'm the one who's supposed to give it." Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable, but there was a glint of understanding in her eyes. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's arm. "You're sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice laced with an eerie calm. He nodded, his decision made. This is the only way. Ethan felt a surge of helplessness, of anger and sorrow all tangled together. But he knew he couldn't stop Marcus, not when the man had made up his mind. The mansion had chosen its sacrifice, and Marcus had accepted his fate. Jonas looked at Marcus with a mixture of respect and regret. The ritual, it requires intent. You have to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. The house feeds on that, on the sacrifice given willingly, with full knowledge. Marcus met Jonas's gaze, the shadows of his past flickering in his eyes. "I understand," he said quietly. "I know what I have to do." The group fell silent, the reality of what was about to happen settling over them like a shroud. The mansion seemed to hum with anticipation, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of expectation. Marcus walked to the mirror, the spirits within watching him with hollow, desperate eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold glass. "I hope this sets you free," he whispered to them, his voice filled with a strange kind of peace. He turned back to the group, his gaze lingering on each of them in turn. "Take care of each other," he said, his voice steady, resolute, "and get out of here before it's too late." Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his throat tight with the weight of unspoken words. "Thank you," was all he could manage, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus gave him a small, sad smile. "Just make sure this counts," he replied, before turning back to the mirror. The house seemed to hold its breath as Marcus took a deep breath, his resolve unwavering. He closed his eyes, focusing on the intent, on the sacrifice he was about to make. The spirits in the mirror grew agitated, their forms swirling, their faces filled with an almost hopeful desperation. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, Marcus slammed his hand into the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 shards. The spirits screamed, their voices filling the room with a deafening roar as they were released from their prison, their agony finally coming to an end. The house trembled, the walls groaning as the curse that had bound it for so long was lifted. The air crackled with energy, a surge of power that knocked the group off their feet. And then, silence. Marcus's body lay crumpled on the floor, lifeless. The mirror was shattered, its power broken, the spirits gone. The mansion, once alive with malevolence, now felt empty, hollow. Ethan knelt beside Marcus, his heart heavy with grief and gratitude. The man who had been an enigma, a shadow in their midst, had given everything to save them. The others gathered around, their faces etched with sorrow and respect. The house had claimed its sacrifice, but in doing so, it had freed them from its grasp. As they stood in the aftermath of Marcus's sacrifice, the realization dawned on them. The nightmare was over, but the cost had been high. The mansion was just a place now, a hollow shell without the spirits that had haunted it for so long. They had survived, but at what price? Chapter 7: The Ritual. The mansion groaned under the weight of its dark history, its very walls seeming to pulse with a malevolent life of their own. The group, now stripped of the innocence they once carried, stood around the room where Marcus's body lay, their faces etched with the grim determination of those who knew there was no turning back. The air was thick with an oppressive dread, a stifling heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. The instructions from the occult books were spread out on the floor, the archaic symbols and cryptic language guiding them toward a ritual that promised either salvation or doom. Sarah, who had become the unwilling guide in this descent into darkness, held the ancient tome in trembling hands. Her voice, once strong, was now laced with doubt and fear as she began the incantation, the words foreign and harsh on her tongue. Ego sum anima, et voco vos ad pacem. Her voice wavered, the syllables cutting through the silence like a knife. The others watched, a mixture of fear and hope warring in their eyes. Marcus's lifeless form was placed before the mirror, the focal point of a ritual that none of them fully understood, but all were desperate to complete. As Sarah continued the incantation, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature plummeted, their breath misting in the air as an icy chill enveloped them. The spirits that had been trapped within the mirror began to stir, their forms flickering just beyond the glass, their hollow eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Jonas, who had become the reluctant scholar of the group, watched the ritual with a growing sense of unease. The symbols that adorned the walls and the floor glowed faintly, their power thrumming beneath the surface. But something felt wrong, twisted. The mansion, once dormant, now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if it had been waiting for this moment for them. "Something's happening," Jonas whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum that had begun to emanate from the walls. The house, it's reacting to the ritual. Ethan felt it too, the subtle vibration in the floorboards, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and move with a will of their own. The mansion was coming alive, responding to the ancient incantation with a growing hostility. He glanced at Claire, who had grown increasingly unstable since Marcus's death. She stood apart from the group, her eyes wide, darting nervously around the room. "We have to finish this," Ethan urged, his voice edged with desperation. "We can't let it stop us now." Sarah's voice grew louder, more insistent, as she fought to maintain control over the ritual. "Ego sum anima, et voco vos ad pacem." But the mansion resisted. The walls creaked and groaned, the floorboards buckling beneath their feet as if the house itself was trying to expel them. Objects began to rattle and shake, some lifting off the ground as the energy in the room reached a fever pitch. The mirror, the central focus of the ritual, vibrated violently, the spirits within it thrashing against their prison with increasing ferocity. Suddenly, Claire stepped forward, her face twisted with a mix of fear and determination. "Stop! This isn't right!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the ritual like a blade. Her hands trembled as she reached for Sarah, pulling her away from the mirror. "Claire, no!" Ethan shouted, lunging to stop her, but it was too late. In her panic, Claire knocked the book from Sarah's hands, sending it skidding across the floor. The ritual was abruptly halted, the incantation left unfinished. The symbols that had glowed with otherworldly power flickered and died, their energy dissipating into the cold air. The mansion responded instantly, violently. The walls shuddered, the floors splintering beneath their feet as the spirits trapped within the mirror screamed in rage. The glass, which had been the only barrier holding them back, shattered with a deafening crash. Shards of the mirror flew through the air, and with it, the spirits, no longer confined, burst into the room in a maelstrom of fury. The room was plunged into chaos. The spirits, now freed from their torment, swirled around them, their forms indistinct but filled with a malevolent energy that lashed out at anything and everything. The air was filled with their wailing, a sound that cut through to the bone, a chorus of agony that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the mansion. Ethan grabbed Claire, pulling her back as the spirits surged forward, their wrath directed at the living who had dared to meddle with forces beyond their comprehension. Jonas tried to retrieve the book, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the ancient pages, but the energy in the room made it impossible to focus. "Sarah, finish it!" Ethan shouted over the chaos, but Sarah was frozen, her eyes wide with terror as the spirits descended upon them. The room was a tempest of violence and despair, the very air thick with the anger of the dead. Marcus's body, once still, was now at the center of the maelstrom, his sacrifice incomplete, his death meaningless in the face of the unleashed spirits. The mansion itself seemed to roar in triumph, the ritual disrupted, the balance tipped irrevocably toward darkness. Claire screamed as one of the spirits lunged at her, its spectral form passing through her with a coldness that burned. She collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs, her mind shattered by the horror of what she had done. Ethan tried to rally the group, his voice hoarse with desperation. "We have to find another way." But deep down, he knew there was no other way. The ritual had been their last hope, and now it was ruined. The spirits, now fully unleashed, filled the room with their presence, their forms swirling in a chaotic dance of death and despair. The mansion was theirs now, its dark history come full circle, its malevolent power fully awakened. As the group huddled together, their hope extinguished, they realized the terrible truth. They had unleashed something far worse than they had ever imagined, and now there was no escape. The mansion had claimed them, body and soul, and it would not be satisfied until it had consumed them all. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. The mansion, once a silent witness to unspeakable horrors, had now become a battleground, a place where the dead sought retribution and the living fought desperately to survive. The air crackled with a malevolent energy as the spirits, no longer confined to their glass prison, swirled through the mansion's decaying halls, their rage directed at those who had once bound them. Ethan and Jonas, battered but resolute, exchanged a silent understanding. They had seen enough death, enough suffering. Now it was time to act, not for survival, but for redemption. The spirit's wrath was no longer indiscriminate. It was a calculated vengeance, seeking out those who had tried to control forces beyond their comprehension. "We have to draw them away from the others," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Jonas nodded, his eyes haunted but determined. They had both felt the weight of failure, but there was no time for regret. The mansion's crumbling walls echoed with the cries of the spirits, and they knew what had to be done. As the group huddled together, Claire's mind raced, grappling with the crushing realization of what her actions had unleashed. The ritual had been their one chance, and she had ruined it. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, but she couldn't afford to crumble under it. Not now. Sarah, her face pale but resolute, placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "We can still fix this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wails of the spirits. "We just need to do it right this time." Ethan and Jonas moved with purpose, each step heavy with the knowledge that they might not make it out alive. The spirits, now fully unleashed, were no longer the helpless entities they had appeared to be within the mirror. They were powerful, angry, and driven by a thirst for justice, or vengeance. The walls of the mansion groaned, the very structure seeming to buckle under the force of their rage. Ethan glanced at Jonas, his old friend, and saw the same grim determination in his eyes. There was no fear, only the understanding that this was the end of the line for them. "We have to buy them time," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "Whatever happens, they need to finish what we started." Jonas nodded, his jaw set. "Let's give them that chance." The two men moved swiftly through the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion, drawing the spirits' attention away from the others. The spirits followed, their forms shifting and flickering, their cold fury palpable. As Ethan and Jonas led them deeper into the mansion, they felt the oppressive energy growing, the air thickening with a cold that seeped into their bones. Meanwhile, Claire and Sarah worked quickly, their hands shaking as they gathered the remnants of the ritual. The ancient book, now stained and torn, lay open before them, its pages whispering of forgotten knowledge and dark magic. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps, but she forced herself to focus. There was no room for error now. "Tell me what to do," Claire said, her voice trembling. Sarah looked at her, eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We need to complete the ritual, but this time we do it to set them free, not bind them." The words of the ritual, once foreign and harsh, now felt different as they passed through Claire's lips. They were words of release, of forgiveness, not control. She spoke them with a fervor born of desperation, her voice rising and falling in the rhythm of the ancient chant. Ethan and Jonas reached the heart of the mansion, a vast, empty chamber that pulsed with a dark energy. The spirits, now fully aware of the trap, circled them, their forms no longer vague but sharp, defined by anger and pain. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the coldness of the spirits pressing against his skin. "Do it now, Claire," he whispered, as if she could hear him across the mansion. "Do it now, before it's too late." Back in the room where the ritual had begun, Claire's voice grew stronger, her hands steady as she completed the incantation. The room around her vibrated with energy, the symbols on the floor glowing faintly as the ritual neared its end. The spirits, drawn to the power of the ritual, began to waver, their forms flickering as they sensed the change in the air. "Set them free," Sarah whispered, her voice a prayer as much as a command. With a final resounding word, Claire completed the ritual. The energy in the room surged, a wave of power that rippled through the mansion, shaking its very foundations. The spirits, once filled with fury, hesitated. They turned towards Claire, their hollow eyes reflecting a brief moment of understanding. In the heart of the mansion, Ethan and Jonas stood side by side as the spirits began to dissipate, their forms fading into the ether. The cold that had gripped them loosened its hold, and for the first time, they felt a warmth, a release. The mansion, too, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the spirits were finally set free. Their torment ended. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving behind a silence that was almost sacred. Claire collapsed to the floor, exhaustion overtaking her. Sarah knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her as tears streamed down their faces. They had done it. They had finally done it. But as the dust settled and the last echoes of the spirits faded, they knew that the cost had been great. Ethan and Jonas were gone, their sacrifice the final act of bravery that had saved them all. The mansion, once a place of unspeakable horrors, was now just a ruin, its dark power broken, its ghosts laid to rest. And as they stepped out into the cold dawn light, leaving the mansion behind, they carried with them the weight of what had been lost, but also the knowledge that they had survived. Chapter 9: The Final Confrontation. The air inside the mansion was suffused with an electric charge, a palpable tension that made every breath feel like it might be your last. The walls seemed to tremble, as though the mansion itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final act to begin. Claire and Sarah stood at the center of the chaos, their hearts pounding in sync with the deep, resonant thrum of the building's dying pulse. The spirits, once mere shadows flitting through the darkened halls, now emerged in full force. Their forms, twisted by centuries of anguish, were more defined, more human, yet they radiated an otherworldly power that set the very air on edge. They hovered around the two women, their faces etched with a mix of sorrow and rage, eyes burning with a fervor that demanded retribution. Claire felt the floor shift beneath her feet, the mansion groaning as if it could no longer bear the weight of its own malevolence. She glanced at Sarah, who stood with her head bowed, eyes closed, whispering something under her breath. It wasn't a prayer, it was a conversation, an unspoken plea for understanding, for release. The spirits surged forward, their collective fury threatening to overwhelm the fragile peace that had barely been achieved. They moved with a purpose now, their anger no longer aimless, but directed at the source of their torment, the mansion itself. The walls, once strong and unyielding, began to crack and splinter, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling as the very structure of the building started to unravel. In the midst of the chaos, Claire felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear that had gripped her since their arrival in this cursed place melted away, replaced by a clarity that cut through the noise and confusion. She understood now. The spirits weren't trying to destroy them, they were trying to free themselves. And to do that, the mansion had to fall. Sarah opened her eyes, and Claire saw something different in them, an ancient knowledge, a deep connection to the spirits that swirled around them. "They were never evil," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying a weight that Claire hadn't noticed before. "They were trapped, bound by the greed and cruelty of my ancestors." The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. The spirits had been victims, not monsters. They had been imprisoned in this place by forces they could not control, and their rage was not born of malice, but of an unbearable pain that had festered for centuries. And Sarah, unknowingly, had been the key to their release all along. The mansion's walls began to buckle, the floor beneath them heaving like a living thing in its death throes. The spirits, sensing their impending freedom, turned their wrath inward, tearing at the foundation of the building with a ferocity that shook the very earth. Windows shattered, beams splintered, and the ground beneath them quaked as the mansion began to collapse in on itself. "Sarah!" Claire shouted over the din, reaching out to grab her friend's hand. But Sarah pulled away, her expression resolute. "I have to see this through," she said, her voice calm even as the world crumbled around them. "It's my family's legacy, my burden to bear." Claire wanted to argue, to pull Sarah away from the madness, but she knew it was futile. This was something Sarah had to do, something only she could do. The spirits had been guiding her, leading her to this moment, and now, as the mansion tore itself apart, she had to finish what they had started. The spirits gathered around Sarah, their forms coalescing into a vortex of light and shadow. They no longer seemed menacing. Instead, there was a quiet dignity in their movements, a grace that spoke of the peace they had long sought. As the mansion's final moments drew near, they turned to Sarah, their eyes filled with a gratitude that transcended words. The walls of the mansion buckled, the ceiling caving in as the building began its final descent into ruin. Claire watched in awe and terror as the spirits, now fully unleashed, directed their energy towards the heart of the mansion. The ground split open, a great chasm swallowing the building whole as the spirits' rage consumed it from within. In those final moments, Claire saw the truth of it all. The mansion had been a prison, not just for the spirits, but for Sarah as well. Bound by the sins of her ancestors, she had been drawn here, not to suffer, but to set things right. And now, as the spirits turned their attention to the last remaining walls, she realized that she was free. Free to live, free to forgive, free to move on. With a final, earth-shattering roar, the mansion collapsed in on itself, the spirits' wrath tearing it apart until nothing remained but a smoking ruin. The dust settled, and the night was suddenly still. The oppressive weight of the mansion's dark history lifted at last. Sarah stood at the edge of the chasm, her face streaked with tears, but her expression was one of peace. The spirits were gone, their torment finally ended, and as Claire joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, she knew that they too were free. The dawn was breaking, the first light of morning casting a warm glow over the ruins of the mansion. The nightmare was over, the final confrontation won, not through violence, but through understanding, through sacrifice, and through the strength to let go of the past. As they walked away from the ruins, the spirits' whispers faded into the distance, their voices no longer filled with pain, but with a quiet, contented silence. And for the first time since they had stepped foot in that cursed place, Claire felt a sense of hope. Hope that, in the end, justice had been served, and the souls that had suffered for so long had finally found peace. Chapter 10: The New Dawn. The first light of day broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, as the survivors stumbled out from the wreckage of what once was the mansion. The weight that had clung to the air, thick and suffocating, was gone, replaced by a strange stillness that felt almost unfamiliar. It was as if the world had been holding its breath, and now, with the spirits finally freed, it could exhale. The group stood on the edge of the ruins, their bodies marked with the dust and grime of their ordeal. Yet there was something new in their expressions, a quiet resilience, a hard-won understanding of the darkness they had faced both within the mansion and within themselves. The terror that had stalked them through those endless nights had been vanquished, not by force, but by a deeper truth they had only begun to grasp. Sarah, the last to emerge, paused at the threshold of the wreckage, her eyes scanning the broken ground where the mansion had once stood tall and imposing. The whispers that had haunted her steps were silent now, the voices that had pulled her into this place finally at rest. She felt their absence keenly, like a void where once there had been a constant gnawing presence. And yet, in that silence, she found a strange sense of peace. Claire moved to stand beside her, their shared ordeal binding them in a way that words could never fully express. "It's over," Claire murmured, her voice hoarse but filled with a kind of quiet conviction that hadn't been there before. Sarah nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the ruins. "Yes," she replied, her tone soft but resolute. "But it's more than that. We came here looking for safety, a place to hide from the world. But safety isn't about walls and roofs. It's about the people we choose to stand beside and the choices we make, no matter how difficult they are. Ethan, his usual bravado, tempered by the reality of what they had faced, joined them, his expression grim yet reflective. We all came here running from something, thinking this place could be our refuge. But it wasn't the mansion we needed protection from. It was ourselves, our fears, our guilt. Jonas, ever the historian, who had tried so hard to understand the past, nodded in agreement. The mansion was a trap, not because of what it was, but because of what we brought into it. We gave it power over us because we were afraid to face the truth about ourselves. And in the end, it wasn't the mansion that saved us. It was letting go of what we were trying so hard to hold on to. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the wreckage, but the light felt warm, reassuring, as if it were pulling them out of the darkness they had been lost in for so long. The oppressive atmosphere that had once surrounded the mansion had lifted, replaced by a clarity that cut through the fog of fear and doubt that had clouded their minds. They stood there for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mansion, once a symbol of sanctuary, had become something far more complex, a reminder that the real refuge lay not in stone and wood, but in the courage to confront the shadows within. Eventually, they turned away from the ruins, their steps heavy but purposeful. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer the same people who had entered that place. They had been tested, broken down, and rebuilt, and what emerged was something stronger, more resilient. They had found in each other the strength to face the horrors that lurked in the dark, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that would outlast even the longest shadows. As they walked away, leaving the ruins behind, there was a sense of renewal in the air, a feeling that, despite everything they had endured, a new beginning was possible. The mansion, with all its secrets and horrors, was a part of their past now, a chapter that had ended. But the lessons they had learned, the understanding they had gained, would guide them forward. Sarah glanced back one last time, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The mansion was gone, reduced to rubble. But in its place, something new had taken root, a belief that true peace could only be found by facing the darkness, not by hiding from it. And as the first full rays of sunlight bathed the landscape in gold, the survivors stepped into the new dawn, leaving the shadows behind. They were scarred, yes, but they were also stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. The mansion had been their crucible, and they had emerged from it not as victims, but as survivors, bound by the knowledge that true refuge could only be found within themselves and in the bonds they had forged in the darkest of times.